Gerard Verga, and welcome to the Florida Family Law Attorney Podcast. It's hard to believe that this is already episode 20. It seems like we just started yesterday, and now we're into our 20th episode. And I'm just thrilled to have our guest on tonight. She just has this resume that you go on for days. You could take up the full 45 minutes just going through her resume, and she's going to be just a great guest. Our guest is Jasmine Allen. Starting off with just her education, she's got a master's in social work from the University of Alabama. She's got a background in outpatient therapy. She's been the kids court coordinator and child family advocate for the 14th Circuit. I'm doing that with the Gulf Coast Children's Advocacy Center here in Panama City, Florida. She's been a teen parenting program, early intervention program social worker, which is interesting. She's been a secretary of the Boys and Girls Club of Bay County on the board of directors. That's, a great honor. President of the Bay County Domestic Violence Task Force, which is something we feel passionate about here on the podcast. She's been involved in our community, American Cancer Society, Relay for Life, and Making Strides. She's been on the Bay Haven Charter Academy, Parent Teacher Student Partnership, High School $1 Million Band Boosters, which we've given some money to over the years, 14th Circuit Victim Advocacy Council. I mean, we could just go on and on for days. Bay District Schools, 2024 Student Wellness Rookie of the Year, Florida DCF System of Care Children's Mental Health Advocate of the Year, Life Management Center Shining Star and Emerging Leader. And we could go on and on about this resume. If you could, Jasmine, I always tell people, I can cover the resume and I can give you an introduction, but the audience wants to hear from you. Can you introduce yourself to the audience and tell us about how you got into this field and why this is your passion?
Sure. I grew up in a family where volunteering was just part of our tradition. We first moved to the Panama City area when I was 4 years old, which was a few years ago. And so we were a military family. So we started out volunteering, visiting residents in some of the nursing facilities who would not have family at the holidays. So I started very young with my parents, and then also as part of our faith community. Unfortunately, we did lose my dad to cancer when I was only 8. And so that left my mom with 2 young children on her own, 1,800 miles from her hometown. And we were just very fortunate, the military community that we were part of, faith community that we were part of, friends that just stepped in like family. And so between growing up volunteering and experiencing some difficult circumstances in my own family, it just gave me a heart for being that caring voice, that caring person when other people were in need. Particularly noticed that when I was a young person in school, at times I noticed not just that not every child that played basketball or was in the marching band with me, not every child had a parent in the stands or someone to take them to and from practice, and I did. And just different. Not everyone had a parent who cheered them on. Some people, unfortunately, grow up with critical parents or absent parents. So along the way, it just really resonated with me to work with young people particularly, but also with families, because the way that you can work with young people and help them to carve a better future for themselves. But when people are still at home, if you can help their parents, you can help the family as a whole. The short version of a lot of great experiences I had and a lot of opportunities I had as a young person, as an adult, that just led me to try and be, like I said, a caring individual for people in need when I can.
It just makes me think of something I've been really focusing on a lot more this year, and something I've just, kind of learned this year, that it's all about your why.
Yes.
People doing family law, if I'm interviewing somebody now for a job here, that's my first question. I want to know about your why, because when you do family law or you're doing social work or you're doing evaluations, sometimes it, takes you to a dark place. It takes you to, some real hard territory. And sometimes even dealing with people who are going through these traumatic events, their socialization may not be the same as if you had met them before. And if you don't have a strong why to keep you there late at night, to keep you pushing forward, to keep you dedicated to your goal, it's hard to do. And I think that why with you really just shines through and through just in the few minutes that we spoke just now. It's very clear that, your why started early and it's been your why ever since. And it'll probably continue to be your why until the day you die. Just, that's how you're wired. You can just tell off the bat. So one of the things I found that was really intriguing about you is, you're an in-house evaluator for a person or for a private investigative firm, and Nolin and Nolin, and that's what you do for them. And I find that very interesting because when I first learned that they had a in-house evaluator, social worker, I thought that was really intriguing and kind of a great concept. And the first question I had was, how does that differ from a social investigator or a guardian ad litem that's appointed in the court system? And what role do you play in their investigation and with their client?
There's probably two big differences. One is I'm not not court appointed, and then the other being that the evaluation tools that I use look at 42 particular components that research, such as the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study and the child welfare system, like federally and local, state level, they look at risk and protective factors for child abuse and neglect. So there's 42 areas that I'm evaluating. One big difference is because I'm working with a private investigative firm, I have the advantage, the opportunity to look at evidence. So any evaluation that I do is objective, and it's based on what we know from research and then what the investigators were able to uncover in the course of their work. So, for example, sometimes in the course of divorce, the issue of whether someone has returned to using substances may come up. And so, which is well known to be a risk factor, but we can't make decisions based on conjecture or assumptions. However, if the investigators can uncover a pattern of repeated substance use, that's very different than someone who's been in recovery for several years, maintaining a job, maintaining a home. So my role is primarily looking at all of the evidence, all of the records that's been gathered, and then looking for those protective factors and those risk factors to help pinpoint what's in the best interest of the children.
It's really cool that you kind of are there in the beginning,
Mhm.
that you're helping the investigators build a better case, that you're also, kind of acting as a filter in some ways as to probably what evidence is relevant, what factors does it go to. Um, what I find in our practice a lot is people come in and they'll have what they think is evidence, or they may have actual concrete evidence, but the evidence isn't relevant to any factor that we might be looking at for child custody, or that it's so remote in time and so old that sometimes people bring up, well, when he was a juvenile, and I'm like, well, did he have kids when he was a juvenile? Because if the kids aren't around, or it predates the kids, it's going to be hard to establish a nexus between the evidence or the allegation and the children. You were talking about the factors you used, and one of those is that ACEs that you were referring to.
Yes. So the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is a small part of it. It gives us it can be somewhat predictive of early trauma, how it can affect us later in life, health wise, risk for substance use, those sort of things. And really, I think part of the way the evaluation that I do is it's really examining what the strengths are just as much as the risk factors, so that when the report is written and it's shared with the parent, and also in their conversations with me when I'm gathering information, my goal is to also build in those strengths, to point those out to parents where they're doing well. Um, and of course, areas where they may need a little bit of assistance or some guidance. The divorce process, I think, can be very difficult. Parents love their children and want the best for them, and sometimes we need a little bit of help knowing exactly what that is. I don't think we often plan for a divorce, so we don't plan to co-parent separately. And then there's the introduction, perhaps, of step parents or different family members. So being able to help parents understand where their children are or their adolescents are developmentally, and how the circumstances are affecting them, and giving them some tools in that process as well, that they can use immediately for their own reassurance. For example, if a parent is going through the divorce process and has some suspicions about their former partner, their estranged husband or wife, and the evidence isn't there, that doesn't always relieve that parent's concerns. So one of the things I'm able to do is share with them safety strategies, how you can prepare your child to adjust to having two homes with two rules and those sort of things, without causing a child to be fearful or feeling like they have to be loyal to one parent or another. That they're safe to love both parents. And I think one of the reasons that I was drawn to working with Nolin and Nolin is that opportunity. It's very often working in mental health, working with families. You do see families, whether it's divorce or there wasn't a marriage, and it can be very difficult for children to transition from home to home and adjust to two sets of rules and things. So the opportunity to help parents navigate that, whether it's what the court orders, but be able to navigate that so that they have the tools they need to help their child be resilient and be successful. And so that hopefully the parent can heal as well.
I think that's, interesting that you hit on a couple of points that are big points for me. When you're talking about the ACEs, that body of knowledge, that was something that, I had practiced family law for about 19 years before anybody introduced me to that. No one had, ever mentioned it. They were talking about ACEs. I was like, what are they talking about? Because it sounded like a card game or something, and about a year or two ago, the Florida bar, through the chair at that time, Sarah Kay, put on a statewide, each circuit had a full day CLE talking about childhood trauma and ACEs and the effects that it has psychologically and actual physical health of the children, if they've been exposed to these traumas. They were citing, increased chances of heart disease, diabetes, other, very serious illnesses, not counting the psychological issues with bonding and being able to form meaningful relationships in their future. And I just thought it was so interesting because I'm not sure when we look at, as lawyers, when we look at Florida Statute 6113 and we look at the factors A through T that tell us what is in the best interest of the child, I feel like it just skims the surface in light of these observations that came out of the ACEs study, as to really what is in their best interest and what's going on. And, even the little snippy comments that parents make about the other parent or, what trauma are you causing? Because, generally speaking, in family law in Florida, a little acrimony between the parents, and it's not going to do anything. It's expected almost. But the long-term effects that can have on the child is not really something that's been explored. And I just think that's interesting. And I really think that what you were saying too about being able to work with the who or the parent who's hired you to kind of teach them how to be a better parent or how to avoid these things and to be stronger and focus on their strengths is that's interesting because as a lawyer, I have a basic understanding, but I don't have a master's degree from the University of Alabama on these topics. And I'm trying to tell them to be a better person, be the bigger person. I make a lot of analogies to the story about King Saul and the baby, and the real mother said, just give her the kid, don't split the baby in half, just give her the kid, and being the bigger person. But, I think, that's oftentimes needed. Yeah, I know that they take a parenting course when they file for divorce and it's court ordered and required, but I don't really think it gets through, or I don't know if it really covers what it needs to cover, honestly, on how to do this and how to cope with it and how to raise a productive child. Because I always tell people, and we can play a game of gotcha with the other spouse or other parent, and they're going to play a game of gotcha with you, and we can point out who's bad or those things. But you may win in court, but your kid will certainly lose because no one is there trying to get to the root problems and co-parent and figure out how to reach an understanding that's not just placing the child in trauma, 24/7 until they turn 18. And so, that's very interesting. And one of the things just hearing you talk, people who know me, sometimes think my mind just wanders, but I was thinking about how many times we have people do a social investigation and they ask me questions about the social investigation. I've never gone through a social investigation. I've never sat in the chair. I don't know what factors are there. I don't know what's important. I don't know what my strengths and weaknesses are. Sometimes, and a lot of people don't notice, there's two types of experts. There's experts that testify and you bring them to court and they present evidence. Then sometimes you have experts that are called work product experts that are for the attorney's own mental impressions about the case and getting the case ready. And I was just sitting there thinking about, Jasmine, you'd probably make a great work product witness, to, have my client kind of evaluate it, go through the steps, look at the evidence, help me build a theory of the case, help the client and me be prepared for the social investigation and how to point out these issues productively. I never will forget a case early in my career. I thought it was a slam dunk, and the person went to the social investigation and they completed it. And when I got the report back, it was, I had 4 sessions. I did this, I did that, went through the whole methodology used. It said this parent never one time told me why he wanted to be with the child or spend time with the child. All he did was put the other parent down for the entire, duration of the evaluation. And, looking back on that, if there had been a Jasmine there, someone to not coach to lie, but coach as to how to deal with this, how to be productive, to look at what factors are, what evidence is there and what the factors really show, and to handle that in a constructive adult manner, probably been very useful. My lesson from that for the rest of my career, I have told people, go to the evaluation, don't say anything bad about the other parent whatsoever. Just tell the evaluator you have some concerns, and when the evaluator wants to talk about those concerns, you're ready to talk about the concerns, and let them bring it up and move on. Just talk about yourself and relationship with the child. That's been my advice, but I do think there's a big opportunity there for work product expert and development and developing the theory of the case and developing the client to identify these shortcomings, strengths, weaknesses, and then really what is important here in the case. And so that was just my 2 cents as I was listening to you talk, and my mind was wondering about family law because that's what I do. My wife tells me I live it, I sleep it. She's like, you're the only person I know who could pick up a case and kind of immediately start coming up with some kind of a theory about family law. But that's my passion, my why. I think you got to, like I said, have a strong why when you've been doing it over 20 years now. Um, so you know when a family law attorney gets a case and they refer it to Nolin and Nolin and referring it to you, what does your evaluation process really look like? What do you do, and how do you typically handle that?
Typically, and varies a little bit from case to case depending on the complexity of the circumstances. But generally, given the case, usually when Nolan and Nolan is nearing completion of their piece of the investigation, and so I'll review all of the reports that they've drawn up. A lot of times, families have information that they share as well, whether the children have had psychiatric evaluations or have any medical needs or that sort of thing. Then so I would do a cursory review of all the information so I know some of the basic facts. And then I have a conversation with the parent that's hired us. And it is a conversation. So when I first introduce myself to parents, I let them know, like, you won't see a clipboard, you're not going to see a checklist. I won't be emailing you a 60-page, 60-item questionnaire. We're going to have a conversation, two people getting to know each other. One of the things I try to assure them of is I am going to be looking for your strengths and hearing from you what's good about you as a parent, what's great about your child, what your concerns are. And so then, as I said, there's 42 questions looking to answer in that conversation. And then and sometimes it's more than one conversation because I love to chat. So it makes it easier to do my role. And then parents love to talk about their children very often. So usually it's pretty easy to get people to share the information that I need to hear. And then I compare what the parent has shared with me with the evidence that's available. And there's times that I may ask the investigators to verify something for me, confirm something for me. So that way my evaluation, I can quote the parent, but I also have something evidence to back up whether it's a risk factor or a concern in that particular case. And then I draw up my evaluation and send the draft both to the investigators and to the parents. So, and after the parents had a day or two to review it, we read it together so that I can again go over that parenting piece and explain if there's. I try to use layman's terms, not a lot of professional jargon, but I do like to provide some education for the parents, some of the research that the evaluation is based on, a lot of child development, and then again, the strengths that they have as a parent and that their family has. Because I would imagine working in family law that quite often there are high expectations of you. And when you meet those expectations, you may not get a lot of attaboys. It's just expected. I think it's very much like that as parents. There are things that, getting our children to school, feeding them, clothing them, loving them, teaching them good values. That's an expectation people have of parents. And we don't often get a lot of kudos for the day in, day out of investing in our children's lives. So I think it's helpful, particularly during a time. Some divorces are probably very amicable, and I would imagine then they wouldn't need you or nor me. But when it's difficult, I think part of that parent education is also helping them to identify what they're experiencing as a parent. And sometimes the concerns they have is just, it's you're going from being an intact family to now your child may be spending a significant part of their time out of your care with the other parent. And it's a difficult transition for a lot of people. And so helping people, parents, to identify what they're experiencing, so they can separate that from, because they can cloud your judgment. If you're hurting a great deal, if your estranged spouse has wronged you in some way, it can be difficult to see clearly how much the child still needs that parent, right? For example, in a case of infidelity, it's very hurtful. It's a betrayal. It's an erosion of trust. It doesn't necessarily mean that they parent any differently. And so that can be very difficult for parents, as they're working through that time of healing, to really truly consider what their child needs. One of the things I saw, and anyone who's worked with children through Department of Children and Families, like the Child Welfare System, the Children's Advocacy Center, children who they'll disclose some forms of abuse that you and I would think it's just horrific. We can't fathom it, and they still love that parent. And so it's, to me, it's very important to make sure we're supporting children, so that, so there are some cases where children do need to be kept safe from their biological parent, and it's important to make those arrangements. And it's also important to honor the love that that child still has. You can love someone who's done something really terrible to you, and that can be difficult to transition to prioritizing your safety.
Yeah, but there's some of the most heartbreaking cases, when you're in a family law case and you're asking for no time sharing or supervised time sharing, and you know that the kid still loves the parent, but unfortunately the detriment that the parent's posing or the danger the parent's posing at that time, requires the safety of the child come first even over that. Then in my mind, now that I've learned about ACEs, I start thinking about, I'm protecting you physically. However, what trauma am I causing emotionally now? And, what are the long term consequences of that as well? And it gets into, you go down the rabbit hole of how you handle this. And then I was talking to a colleague of mine last weekend. We were having dinner and we were talking about Florida, has kind of a unique position on getting your act together as a parent is not a substantial change to modify. So if you have the initial custody determination and the judge really restricts time sharing or orders no time sharing, let's say you're, an alcoholic, or you have a drug problem, or you have anger issues to the point where the judge kind of, gives you very limited time sharing or no time sharing, just because you get sober or go to anger management and find your inner peace or whatever it is you've done, the judge is very likely to tell you, based on the current case law, that there's no substantial change in circumstances. We joke around about that and try to remember it as he had wrote an outline of some cases and something we were going over, and he didn't use the word act. You can kind of guess, probably the audience can guess what word he used about the getting your act together. You know, is not a substantial change. So that's it's unfortunate in some ways. And we were talking about balancing that need for stability and not modifying the judgment too often, coupled with a parent who's really made a heartfelt 180 and has gotten their life together. But that's the only thing that's changed, and you may not be able to reestablish the relationship or get a better time sharing schedule. So it's I'm not sure if that rule, if there's really no risk of relapse, or it's very minimal, if that rule really meets the best interest of the child in light of something like ACEs. And we know in that body of knowledge now. So sometimes I think the factors that we look at, I'm not saying that they're out of date,
Right.
but I don't know if you can cover it in 20 factors and, cover all the issues that arise now and that people have knowledge about. So, it's hard. And as a lawyer, I can tell you now, it's very unsettling to me when I know I'm going to court and I'm really trying to remove somebody's time sharing or the absolute minimal time sharing, something I take very serious. And, I hear it all the time. Oh, can't we just get no time sharing? Or he doesn't care, or she doesn't, unless there's some hard evidence, it's probably not going to happen. And honestly, instead of being the person who wants to strip the child from that, I've always told clients, let's go to court and, obviously get the child the protection it needs, but maybe we pursue a temporary order since it's not a final judgment. And let's try to give the other parent the carrot and the incentive to get their act together, because the kid is going to be traumatized if there's only, one parent just disappears, no time sharing. One case I remember is very specific. There was a real risk of the person overdosing. It was a real possibility that this was going to be happening in the future if there was not some intervention staged. And the parent was very aggressive about wanting to capitalize on the current situation. And I was fine, of course, with capitalizing on the situation to get the child into a place that was safe. But I remember having a real discussion about, hypothetically, in the future, what happens when this child gets notified that the other parent's deceased because they've overdosed.
Right.
Did we really win? Is that a win? We won in court. We got the sheet of paper, but that's not going to be a win for that child. That child's going to carry that scar forever. And so, what can we do to try to protect the child, not only from the physical harm, but also the future trauma that the offending parent can cause, either directly or indirectly through their actions? So, you talked about risk assessment reports, and that's a new term for me. So, can you tell the audience what a risk assessment report is, and how that can significantly impact their case?
Sure. So those 42 criteria that I'm looking at, and that's things like both parents, the type of parenting they had, the families they come from, whether there's been any substance abuse, whether there are medical needs, if there's a history of family violence of any sort, those sort of, so it's just a number of factors. So those are the risk factors that are the criteria that I'm looking at. And then I pair those with the risk factors that the child welfare system recognizes. So, and as well as the protective factors. So the emphasis. So I was trying to think of an easy example. What I think something that comes up a lot is, for example, a history of substance use, and then at what point, when someone's been in recovery and is stable, is there no longer a risk? Well, the risk remains. It's whether there's an immediate threat or not. So that, to me, the protective factors are really essential. So every one of us, whether we're a parent or not, we have risk factors, and some of us have more than others. I might identify a dozen risk factors in one parent, but the protective factors are so strong. That's really what gives you a better picture. So that's things like the type of support you have immediately in your family, as well as community ties, professional ties, the relationship the family has with the school, the education system, or childcare. It's things. One key factor, protective factor, is a parent's knowledge of child development. So if you have understanding that a 4-year-old can help with dishes, but isn't going to cook the full meal and do all the dishes by themselves, which sounds basic, but there's some other things that, what age should a child be potty trained? At what age can a child really define the word respect? Those kind of things. And so the evaluation, that the report that I draw up gives, similar to like the social evaluator, it'll have the social history, and then it will also identify what the risk factors are, the protective factors that are present, and then a summary of like the parental capacity, which just is your combination of risk and protective factors. So if you're someone who has a family history of substance abuse and a prior history yourself and has been in recovery for several years, some of the protective factors might be having a plan in place to prevent relapse, continuing treatment on an ongoing basis to prevent relapse, continuing to have a stable occupation, stable housing, supportive family and friends, a good informal support system is things like your church, hobbies, like if you're a part of a men's club or in an athletic association, as well as formal supports, which is things like you have a primary care physician, you have a psychiatrist or a therapist who's helping treat the substance abuse, that sort of thing. Usually, I like to start with the strengths and then summarize the strengths again so that it stands out to parents as they're reading. Because really, you're reading about yourself in that evaluation, as well as the parent that the other parent, they're expressing concerns. So, and that's why we call it a risk evaluation, because it is identifying all the risk factors that we have evidence for. If there's ones that have been reported, they'll be noted, but we note that it's based on the parent's report, not that it's confirmed.
So, you kind of piqued my curiosity with this.
Okay.
So the risk assessment factors, the initial factors you look at, who promulgates those or where do they come from?
So it's a combination of the reports, the investigation reports, any documentation that the family provides or that the investigators provide, as well as the conversations with the parent. So very often something may come up that the parent discloses during our conversation that will identify as that they reported it, but it may not be something that we can. So some things that are easy to confirm is if they came from an intact family, or if if they are undergone divorce, or if they have multiple divorces or that kind of thing. Those are things that are pretty easy, that are easy to gain evidence for. Some things that are more difficult is someone that has a history of substance abuse and they claim that they are sober, but there's concerns that they are not. So sometimes that's something you can't always definitively prove. Sometimes people are not as careful as they think they are. So, I mean, sometimes it's quite obvious, for example, someone who is known at local bars or who has been trespassed from bars because of their inebriated behavior or who continues to get DUIs or that kind of thing. That's a pretty strong case for the fact that they are not sober.
I
And
think
some
you
things
said
are
that.
protected, they're confidential. If someone is seeking mental health treatment, that's not something that we would have access to unless they share that with us.
So, I think if I heard you right, you said there were 42 factors. Is that right?
Yes.
Where do the 42 factors come from?
Years ago, I worked for the Healthy Families program, Healthy Families Florida, and so Ounce of Prevention Fund of Florida, and so it's a combination of an assessment tool that I learned there, the Healthy Families Family Assessment Tool, and it's based on the ACEs. It's based on the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the risk and protective factors for child abuse. So it's really there are 42 criteria, but some of them fall under one category. So, for example, history of substance abuse, there's a number of criteria under that category. So, it would be things like, is it a family history? Is it something that someone had treatment for or not? Has it caused legal or professional disruptions? So, for example, has a person been arrested because of their substance use? Have they lost jobs because of their substance use? It's 42 criteria, but some of them, like I said, fall within a larger category.
Do you ever use any factors or assessments that are adopted by the Department of Children and Families?
Yes. Some of the things, there's some things you have to pay. There's like curriculum or assessment tools that require that you purchase them. And so if there are some that I have access to, some that I do not. So we try to avoid incurring expenses for the family. So, and I do try to use evidence-based approaches that are recognized by Department of Children and Families, that are recognized by our court system. So that way it's something that's familiar to, maybe the circuit judge or to the opposing attorney, that kind of thing. So far we've been really fortunate that I think it's a new approach. I'm a sort of a novel piece. There's not really a lot of private investigators using a social worker. So I've it's sort of been handpicked cases that have been referred to me where there was, the investigators felt like they had evidence that there was risky behavior, whether it's substance use or if there is family violence with their current or subsequent partner, things along those lines. And those are very often have been the times when they've asked me to help with the investigation and to do the risk evaluation.
Yeah, we're going to try and change gears here for just a
Sure.
minute. Because we went over your resume in the beginning and you were just so involved in this community. And I just want to know about, your involvement in the community and how that kind of shaped you as a social worker and as an evaluator and what role that kind of plays, in your day-to-day job.
Sure. Great question. So, as I shared, I grew up in a family and in a faith community where volunteering was part of the tradition. And then, particularly, I would imagine you encounter this as well, working in family law. Sometimes there are, in my role as a social worker, when I was a case manager, or, for example, when I worked with the Early Learning Coalition, and there were some challenges that I observed some of the parents who had survived domestic violence encountered, not knowing their victims' rights, not knowing the court system and the procedures. So that was when I became involved in the domestic violence task force. And I had some experience because I was trained as a victim advocate when I worked with Children's Advocacy Center. So being able to volunteer sometimes, in my professional capacity, there's a particular role, but then volunteering, it gives me the opportunity to help fill a role maybe where there's some gaps in some holes in our safety nets, or where there's a need for advocacy. I'm also a survivor of domestic violence. I felt like, particularly when I was president of the domestic violence task force, gave me an opportunity to be a voice for a lot of survivors who haven't found their voice, who to answer difficult questions like, why people who are being abused don't immediately leave, or why they return to an abuser, and what it feels like to live by a safety plan and to trust a variety of professionals to every day do their job 100% because it affects you and your child's safety. It's a very vulnerable place. So I just feel like the things we endure sometimes are not for us. They prepare us to help others and to be a voice for others. And certainly when I have the opportunity to be that voice, I'm willing to do so. It helps us. I think we all play our role, and it helps us. We all help each other when we speak up.
It's really, just such a great thing. You don't hear people really with that kind of passion for community involvement and how it shapes their professional, stance and their views on things. We, here at the firm, we've always been kind of community minded and community oriented, and something you said there about, helping them find their voice. And that's something I say here a lot as a lawyer. There are times where people come in and they're just emotionally beat down or drained. And eventually, at some point through the process, hopefully we find a good theory of the case and we're going over questions and cross examination questions. And you can just see them kind of light up because you found their story, you found their voice, and they have confidence now that somebody's going to tell their story in a way that it's going to get heard. And sometimes I think that's even more important than perhaps the outcome of the case is them psychologically just knowing I'm going to be heard. My story is going
Yes.
to be heard. I've been found in the wilderness here, and somebody gets me and gets where I'm coming from and understands these facts that I've been dealing with. I think that's, just, that's as a lawyer, to me, that's when you've hit the jackpot, and you found somebody's story and you were able to tell it and to get it out there to the right people to hear it. And that's what it's all about at the end of the day. And I think that requires you stepping out of you for a minute and just hearing and listening, spending the time, getting to know them, and then getting to know every fact of it and piecing it together, and you know just kind of transcending the situation and to get there and to give somebody a voice in some circumstances and this world's never had one. No one would listen to them, or they were just not a strong person on their own who could ever get it out there. And to me, that's where it's at as an attorney. And that's something I really I hope I can do in every case. I know it's not possible probably in every case, but that's something I always make my goal is to figure out what that story is and to help them get it, get it heard. One thing that kind of was interesting to me is, it's like you've kind of been a guest lecturer. You graduated summa cum laude at, I think, 3 institutions. Congratulations on that. I was recently at Mosley High School talking to the guidance counselor, and they were telling me now you have to have a 4.65 to go to University of Florida. So my joke with them was, I guess they're going to come repo my diploma because I don't think I ever saw a 4.65. Tell us about, serving as an intern supervisor and a guest lecturer, both at Florida State and at Troy State University, and what you did there in those roles and how important, continuing education is in your field.
So, a large part of the code of ethics for social workers is respecting the worth and dignity of each individual, advocating for the vulnerable, being non judgmental. And I think one of the things that's most difficult, particularly for people who plan to pursue social work to become licensed clinical social workers and provide therapy, is the right to self determination, which means that people have the right to make mistakes. And so when you supervise interns, very often nonprofit organizations, state organizations, there's a lot of high caseloads, a lot of complex problems that you encounter, a lot of long hours. And so the internship is an opportunity to really give somebody who's just about to enter the field a good, solid foundation in social work practice. And to me, a key part of that is taking care of yourself. And that's now become part of the curriculum for social work, particularly well, we're bachelor's and graduate students, because it's so important to be healthy ourselves in order to give constantly to other people. And I think one of the people who enter caring professions, it's usually because you have a caring heart. So it's when you supervise interns or when I have the opportunity to speak to students, it's an opportunity to plant those seeds of preparing them to have healthy boundaries, to recognize, for example, I speak a lot when I've supervised people, whether they were employees that I supervise or interns. This is our role. It's really important to know what my professional role is, what my responsibilities are, and on a daily basis, prepare myself and evaluate how well I'm doing those pieces. And ultimately, you have to trust that the other cogs in the big system are doing their pieces, because none of us can be all things to all people. But if each of us do our role exceptionally well, then we're doing our part, and that's difficult. And when I had to take my own advice, there's a one point I was a single mom with two kids, one in high school, one in grade school, and serving on six boards of directors. And we have such a great community in the Panhandle. We have such great communities and such great organizations like Boys and Girls Club or, Girls Inc. that do wonderful things for our community. There are a lot of wonderful people, and I can pass the baton to them and raise my own children and be home. What really it came to a head, my oldest son, I think he was a freshman in high school, and we got home one day earlier than usual. And so he throws open the living room doors and he says, "And this is the living room by daylight." I thought, oh, maybe he's expressing a need for a little more downtime. So, because our family likes to stay active and things, so scaled back a bit, because then you allow other people to have those same opportunities to grow and to learn and to share talents that I may not possess, and a different eye and different insight to keep those organizations going. But I'll just put a plug in. If you have not yet found your spot, there are so many organizations that could use volunteers, even if it's just an hour or two a month. It's each of us have something to offer, and a lot of organizations, there's a lot of need, and so and limited resources.
Well, I'm gonna have to use your son's line. I'm gonna have to go to my house and tell my wife, "This is what our house looks like on Saturday. This is what my couch looks like on Saturday." She always tells me, "You run a tight ship," and I'm like, "No, you run the tight ship." We're always on the go, either with work stuff, bar stuff, community events.
Yeah.
I think it was 2 or 3 weekends ago, we were over in Pensacola. We sponsored a 5K teen challenge, that was helping people who were coming out of, human trafficking, and they had built a house or had a house, and it was having some issues with the roof and needed a new roof, and so it was to raise money for that. So sometimes it's draining, as far as your personal time. At the end of the day, it's rewarding, and it's what you look back on in life and say, "Hey, I could have sat on the couch, or I could have helped with this." And it's gonna sound cheesy, but it just reminds me of my kids when they were little and reading the Lorax book to them. Unless someone like you cares a whole lot, nothing's going to get better. And I think that's, kind of the thing that we've tried to bestow on our kids. And part of our culture here at work is, community involvement, because if the community is strong, then the business is strong. And, we need that. And I think you're right. Bay County, Okaloosa, Escambia, Santa Rosa, the whole panhandle. I really think that we have a great community here of people who just are ready to step up. And, I thought Hurricane Michael was really a good test of that, because, people were talking about how long is this going to take and how long is this going to take. And I told them, I said, "Do you hear those chainsaws going? That's not the government. They're not even here yet. They don't even know what happened." I was like, "Those are just people who went to their shed and got their chainsaw out, and they cut themselves free first with the trees, and then they went and did their neighbors, and they just kept going until, it was all piled up on the side of the road and it came together."
Yes.
And I think that's, the community that we live in. And it's a testament to, I think, who we are in the panhandle. Sometimes I go around the state. I think there's some misconceptions about the panhandle
There are, yes.
in other parts of the state. I think some parts of the state may wish us to be part of Georgia or part of Alabama or something. But I think, people who really come up here with an open mind and see our community at work. I had an attorney who worked for us who works in like South Central Florida, and she came up once and was like sold. So once I sell my house, like I'm moving up here. I think that community goes a long way. All right, so this is our thought leader question for you. All right. This is where you're going to get to really hopefully shape your field and kind of predict the future. So, given your extensive experience and current role with Nolin and Nolin and Associates, where do you see your field going? Where is it heading? What changes would you like to see in the field? And how would you like to see family law courts utilize your expertise or utilize this knowledge that they're not doing now?
As we talked about a little bit, evaluations give me the opportunity to share with parents what their strengths are and to provide education how they can navigate this difficult time. There's a couple of social work is continually, I think, aiming to meet the needs of our community and our even our country change. I think one area of social work that particularly interests me is financial social work, where you're pairing our knowledge of human development and the human psyche with people's spending, their financial habits, and helping people make a transition from marginal or lower incomes into a healthier income. And part of that is knowing, your relationship with money, knowing some of the things that you've learned from your family, that kind of thing, the community you're in. And I think that fits really well with people, particularly when you divide a household, the finances change. And that can be very stressful. And I think sometimes that can be maybe some of the argument as to who gets which pieces of the finance and that sort of thing. And it has an ongoing effect on the children in that home. Going back and forth between two homes if that becomes part of the equation, but just the logistics of getting them to and from the same school or being able to participate in extracurricular or arts or those kind of things. So I think, for a while, there's been the court ordered evaluations, the social evaluator. I think for a piece that I would love to see become almost traditional or very often offered is some family counseling for people going through divorces, separations, any sort of significant change in their family. For example, if someone's terminally ill, they may be eligible for their family can be eligible for hospice services. And part of that is serving the family as a whole and helping them navigate their grief, helping them say goodbye, helping them, figure out what the rest of their life looks like. So I think a service as an opportunity that I have is to provide a similar service. How do we grieve the marriage that's ending? How do we put the children and their needs first? And how do we take care of ourselves as parents, so that the future looks brighter for all of us? Ideally people stay married, right? But when that doesn't happen, finding a way to heal, to forgive one another, to work together so that everyone comes out the best that they can. I think that's a huge opportunity. And very often people, depending on their insurance or their financial resources, they can take part in mental health counseling. A lot of times it's individual though, and there's not as much coverage for family counseling, which I think can be very helpful. Helping children like find their voice as well to be able to speak to their parents and express their needs um, and to express how they're feeling and recover from the change that they're going through.
That's a universal truth. It's just honestly so profound what you just said. And I was sitting here thinking about it. We always hear about the mental health crisis we're having in this country. I know last year alone, I sat through countless Florida Bar Committee meetings where we were talking about shared parenting, decision making related to mental health, how to best get kids into mental health, what happens when the parents don't agree, what happens if a parent stalls the process, and I think we are at a crossroads, whether it's our society, whether it's doom scrolling, having 24-hour information always available. I'm not really sure what the cause is all the way around, but I think, there's definitely a lot of people out there who feel like we're on this mental health crisis. And, what you're talking about here is, the availability of mental health professionals when you're dealing with these traumatic moments and will your insurance cover it? And what will your insurance cover? Will they cover family therapy? Will they cover marriage counseling? Will it cover parent child counseling? And then how many sessions do you get with the insurance, per year, per 6 months? It's one of those things where if society is not well and mental health is not well, then everything else crumbles with it. And again, with families, if the family unit is going through these, I'm not saying inevitable, not you don't have to get divorced, but there are circumstances it's going to happen. Okay, so we can either ignore the problem and not have a solution, or to proactively, ask about it and recognize it, and then get the insurance company to cover it or build it into the system. One thing I used to, really think about a lot is, our filing fee in Florida is pretty stout. You're looking at almost $500 to file. I know when you get a marriage license, they discount it if you do certain counseling and, premarital counseling. And I've always thought that, whether it's, uh, marriage counseling, to try to save the marriage, or if it's, not the DCF class, the pre approved class, but real counseling. Because I'm gonna be honest, most people I think just hit play on that and do the bare minimum to get the certificate. Then, perhaps, maybe the filing fee should be less, or there's some incentive to do these things. And then honestly, funding the system, the court system, to have these resources built in or available to people, I think, would make a lot of difference. When we as lawyers have been on this real push to from the judiciary to and the legislature to move these cases faster. Sometimes I think as a family law attorney, I mean, sure, we could have a trial and I could just force this log jam to an end and break it. However, sometimes people do better when they're allowed the time to heal or the
Right.
resources to heal, and they end up untying their own knots. Whereas if I take you to trial and I cross examine you and put you through the ringer and the stress of all that, and nobody wants to go to and go through, does that really heal the family? Does that make them better co-parents? Does it make them get along? Or how much scar tissue did we really just create? How many generations are going to pay for this? I think that's, something that you really hit on that's pretty profound. And it's not going to get better until we make some changes and make it more available. Well, look, like I told you when we started, it would go by super fast. And I think we were supposed to shoot for 45 minutes, and now we're over an hour. Um, we are definitely going to have you back on if you'll give us your time and expertise
Absolutely.
again.
Thank
Because we didn't even get through a fraction of the questions. I heard you earlier talk about Judge Pittman,
you. Yes.
and you know, Judge Pittman was a circuit judge here for a long time, family law. She kind of was one of the judges who broke me in as a young attorney.
Okay. Yeah.
Behind her back, I used to call her Judge Judy. So if she sees this, because I know she's on Facebook, just a very nice and classy lady, but you did not want to cross her. And I never will forget, she taught me a valuable lesson. It was not anything I personally did wrong, but somebody in their testimony stated, because she didn't drop them off, I didn't drop them off, referred to the kids as a pawn in the game or something, something of that nature. And this classy, well composed judge, the look on her face and her eyes, protruding out of her head, stood up and told me to take that person out into the hallway and talk with them and talk to them about the realities of what was going to about to happen in that case. Uh, I
I
never
can
will forget
only
that,
imagine.
how, how personal it was to her that the children not be used as a pawn in some kind of a chess match between the parents. And, that's something that always stuck with me, and I always ask myself about the motives and what we're doing here. And or is this, some kind of a perverse strategy? Is this really necessary? What can we do to make sure that we don't fall into that trap? I do think a lot of people get angry, and that's a very easy trap to fall in. But, so Jasmine, if people want to get up with you and Nolin, how do they get up with you? How do they contact you and get your help?
I think the best way, the phone number for Nolan and Nolan Associates is 850-899-2717. The website is NNA, so Nolan Associates, NNAinvestigations.com. And that is the easiest way to catch up with the investigators and with me.
Well, we appreciate you coming on.
Thank
We
you for
appreciate
having
you
me.
giving us your time tonight and being just so open and honest about everything and putting some real insights to this issue and maybe helping, hopefully countless people watch the video at some point and helping them, kind of understand the process a little better and where they need to be coming from and what they need to be thinking about. And of course, if you're out there and you're listening to this, the whole purpose is just to give people good information about family law and issues ancillary to family law. And, I want to spread that out to as many people as possible. So if you could remember to please like, share, subscribe. If you think this is helpful to somebody that's going through something like this, point it out to them. It's just designed to be a free resource that, hopefully provides people with good quality information from people who have expertise and, whether it be social work, mental health, accounting. We just need, people need to hear this who are going through the process. So, but thank you so much for coming on. And I cannot
Thank you.
wait to have you back on. So we probably won't be long. We can
Great.
finish up these questions and maybe even really delve into this ACEs thing because that's something that I think attorneys and or people going through this couldn't hear enough. All right.
Right. Yes.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Jasmine.
much.